There is no more important exopolitical question to be resolved than the status and potential impact of technology encountered, researched, developed, and implemented from access to retrieved extraterrestrial vehicles. Resolution is required because that technology has been sequestered by the government, which has had such vehicles, pretty sure, for 61 years.
The very presence of these vehicles in our skies has spawned a wealth of speculation and citizen science research into alternative science and energy. And by that, I don't mean solar panels and geothermal. Every aspect of human society and the environmental state of the planet could be transformed if the technology behind the energy and propulsion of these vehicles is as powerful as it seems.
Yeah, let me be really clear, folks. This is where the rubber meets the road. This is why any American, any Briton, any Italian, any Zimbabwean should care, even if they've never seen anything in the sky and don't care if they ever do. But this is why this issue should matter to them. Therefore, we are pleased to have with us this morning a man who could well be the leading authority in the world on the status and scope of exotic alternative energy research. What he talks about could impact your life in ways you cannot even imagine at this time.
He's the president of Integrity Research Institute and editor of the well-respected Future Energy newsletter and e-news. He has authored 6 books and numerous scientific studies, articles, and papers related to energy in all forms. He provides consultations on electrical product design and development, engineering testing, environmental electromagnetic field energy, expert testimony, and opinion. He meets regularly with congressional and Senate leaders and briefs them on the latest energy developments, and his views regarding energy-related matters have been featured on national media, including CNN.
As a patent examiner for physics measuring testing instrumentation section of the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, he has examined and approved patents related to electric and non-electric properties, testing in specific environments, calibrating electric meters, sensing electricity, internal combustion engine ignition systems, electromechanical switching devices, thermoelectric properties, electrostatic, God, it's good I took that physics degree, electrostatic field sensing, fault detection, impedance admittance testing, power measurement, motor generators. This is the whole enchilada, folks. He is, and he has been elected to the board of the PTO Society in 1999.
And in his spare time, he's also an inventor of several instruments, including the Premier machine, the photonic rejuvenation energizing machine and immunizing Gauss meter, static field Gauss meter, ELF spectrum analyzer, and a geomagnetometer, which are still on the market today, or are on the market today. Responsible for engineering department projects at Integrity Electronics, he managed engineers and technicians, initiated several instrument lines, trained industrial interns from SUNY at Buffalo, designed 2% accuracy calibration procedures, specification sheets, and training manual representing the company at shows as well and conferences.
Our speaker is a consulting fellow of the World Innovation Foundation, is a member of the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers, the National Space Society, the Union of Concerned Scientists, the Bioelectromagnetic Society, and formerly the American Physical Society.
He also holds a Ph.D. in General Engineering from Kennedy Western University, an M.A. in Physics from SUNY at Buffalo, a B.S. in Physics and Electrical Engineering as well, and is a licensed professional engineer with the state of New York. Please welcome Dr. Thomas Malone to X Conference 2008.
Thank you. Well, after that introduction, hopefully we'll still have about 20 minutes for the entire presentation. I've never seen a tag team for an intro. This is really impressive. So I'm happy to be here with you, and I have lots of information that I've padded the energy technology of UFOs with. And of course, exopolitics is very important, and the technology of UFOs, I feel, is the primary interest that humans should have, as well as, of course, the camaraderie and the relationship that might develop with our extraterrestrial friends. Well, to get you oriented, first of all, we are here, over in the spiral arm of the galaxy. Can we turn the sound down just a little bit? There's a little echo in my voice there. And the spiral arm of the galaxy, I'm not sure if the laser is going to do much good here, but the arrows certainly point to where I'm talking about. The outer suburbs, in case you don't know your astronomy, of the galaxy are the younger stars. The older stars are in the galactic core area. Does that sort of bode any kind of relationship in terms of time? You know, when your older brother and sister had to jump on a number of years and then you just got started in your family, what happened? Did they sort of know a little bit more about the world than you did? Think about it. This is our galaxy. And of course, far, far away from civilization is not really true. Now, night lights, of course, are visible from space, and they indicate where all the artificial activity on Earth is, especially unidentified frivolous objects found in Las Vegas. But seriously, folks, I'd like to present the fact that UFO-related phenomena has actually been featured on the cover page of the Washington Post. This is a 10-year anniversary, just about, of this article. But the interesting thing is this was a panel of scientists presenting exactly what I'm interested in, is the physics of unidentified flight objects. And specifically, they cited the gravitational and inertial effects that should be studied more seriously. This is from June 29th, 1998. And their report was published in the Journal of Scientific Exploration, also in the same year. And so what we have here is an invitation to kind of look at the comparison, of course, that you know about to what the black world's been doing and what the civilian world should be doing to catch up. So I thought I would just take a brief break from the slideshow just to give you this 5-minute Fox News clip that many of you may not have seen because it just aired about a month ago.
Okay, read this.
Are we alone in the universe? It is a question people have pondered for centuries. And now, new declassified documents could prove we're not.
Among the evidence out there, strange lights over the U.S. Capitol more than 50 years ago. Fox 5's Brooke Baldwin investigates UFOs in Washington.
Phoenix, Arizona, March 13th, 1997.
It actually happens. This isn't a figment of somebody's imagination.
Chicago, Illinois, November 7th, 2006.
I got it on tape! I got it!
Dublin, Texas, January 8th, 2008.
This is an amazing sighting. This is unheard of.
Eyewitnesses report something mysterious in the skies.
I hear the humming noise. It goes over the house, goes into the field. I see these lights.
People claiming to have had an out-of-this-world experience.
People think I'm crazy because I will come forward and tell this story.
3 unusual sightings caught on tape. Each, according to some, has a reasonable and logical explanation.
This is planet Venus.
Others, though, believe these sightings are something bigger, something from another galaxy.
We're talking about hundreds of thousands of cases, and I don't think there's a single day where there aren't very strong cases that are reported somewhere in the world.
An alien invasion or a government cover-up. These recently declassified documents show just how seriously the government has treated these sightings, including one front-page story here in D.C.
The sky is the stage, the actors so-called flying saucers. And they're back on the scene with some new twists.
July 1952, air traffic controllers at Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland pick up 10 to 12 unidentified objects on radar. Minutes later, another sighting, this time at Washington National Airport. The Air Force sent up 2 fighter aircraft to intercept the flying objects, according to confidential security information now released to the public.
The Air Force did respond in scrambled jets, and it was imaged and photographed over, I believe there were 9 of them that were actually in formation.
Dr. Stephen M. Greer is the founder of the Disclosure Project. His organization collects information on unexplained sightings from all over the world, including the more than 2,000 reports around D.C. in the summer of '52, now known as the Washington Nationals.
It's been very hard to bring out the information without it getting linked instantly to something that ends up being embarrassing.
This famous photo shows 7 bright objects flying near the Capitol dome. Radar also picked up 4 more objects in Beltsville and in Herndon. Facing increased pressure from the public, the military held a news conference saying the objects seen throughout the region were weather-related, nothing more than, quote, temperature inversion.
We have, as of date, come to only one firm conclusion with respect to this remaining percentage, and that is that it does not contain any pattern of purpose or of consistency that we can relate to any conceivable threat to the United States.
A conceivable threat that made it all the way to the Oval Office.
The president got very interested and wanted some kind of a solution.
Reserve Air Force Captain Kevin Randall has been studying UFOs for years. He's written 18 books, one of them specifically about the D.C. sightings.
The Air Force says basically, well, what it was is temperature inversions. Were there inversion layers over Washington, D.C. in July of 1952? The answer is yes, there were. Were they of sufficient strength to cause the problems you see on the radar? No.
Controversy arises. Maybe the puzzling objects are from another planet.
Puzzling objects Dr. Greer believes are behind a cover-up at the highest level.
Everyone who I know who were military or intel were told, you didn't see this, you were not on the squadron that went up, the radar operators were told, this never happened.
But something did happen those July nights. Whether it was alien or not is still debatable. Kevin Randall, though, believes it's only a matter of time before the truth comes out.
I believe what's going to happen eventually is there's going to be a UFO event that is inexplicable and leave the evidence behind that we cannot just explain away.
Which means events like the Washington Nationals in 1952, the Phoenix Lights in 1997, the saucer over Chicago's O'Hare Airport in 2006, and the sightings in Texas earlier this year could just be the beginning. Brooke Baldwin, Fox 5 News.
And that was just about a month ago, so this is exciting to see this on Fox TV. And of course, the classified documents basically are dealing with things that dealt 50 years ago, but the fact that they're declassifying them is the most important. And that's what we're talking about as well. So let me go back to where we were. There we go. So one of the interesting developments in that area is also this book that just came out. Some of you may have seen it. The title, of course, is pretty imposing. I could tell you, but then you would have to be destroyed by me. Anybody hear that before? That's the actual title of the book. And it's describing only the emblems from the Pentagon's Black World. And I thought I'd give you some of the samples, too, just to show you the flavor. I mean, you can actually, I know there's a few artists here as well. It's interesting to learn from their presentation what kind of mentality these people have. It's, of course, this is the collection of some of the most morbid, Alone and on the Prowl, Grim Reapers, and so forth. Freedom in the Cosmos, I thought, was inspiring. Of course, they're probably aiming a lot farther than the Earth by that kind of phraseology. And global engagement, of course, is certainly pretty all-encompassing. Recently declassified plane, Bird of Prey, was declassified in 2002. So declassifications actually happen. I've talked to the deputy director of the National Reconnaissance Office when he was at the National Space Society about declassification. And you know his answer was? He says, well, what you're talking about, and I specifically described a technology that I will later in this talk, and he says, well, you know, in this situation, that type of technology keeps getting higher and higher in classification levels until it's out of sight. That was his quote. He says, it's easier for us to pay a contractor to reinvent it and reinvent it, and then it'll come out at a lower classification level. So that was his assessment of the problem. And of course, there's the Monitor project that's still classified. And then the collection here shows the kind of perhaps extraterrestrial connection that I think is also pretty unusual. Tastes like chicken? What is the ET doing here with this B-2 bomber? Well, I'm not sure, but keep your distance, you uninitiated people, and of course let them hate us so long as they fear. Maybe we make threats, not promises. That's sort of a very imposing presentation as well. So you might get a flavor just from this particular book that perhaps there's a lot more going on in the black world than we normally hear about. And of course, many speakers have done that. But can civilians visit Mars? That's the big question. Well, certainly not by carrying fuel. And this has been proven over and over again with billion-dollar projects. For example, in 1986, the space plane was canceled in 1993 after basically it couldn't work. The scramjet idea was ahead of its time. No one knew whether the engine could operate at hypersonic speeds. The Delta Clipper in the middle there, 1991, fell over as it landed and crashed. And so the accident was in 1996, 5 years later. And then the most absurd thing was the X-33. Lockheed Martin thought they could fill this entire metal balloon with fuel and then fly it up to space and back. And liquid hydrogen. Talk about a shell disaster. The X-33 was sort of headed in the same direction. And that was canceled in 2001. So carrying fuel is not really a great idea. Now, what about burning fuel on the Earth? Well, that's been proven to be a problem as well. And we're now just beyond Hubbard's peak. So the peak has basically been already proven to be 2006, and we're now dealing with the problem. On CNN, I basically was warning the fact, this was now 6 years ago, that the impending oil crisis was hitting and we should prepare for it now. Of course, the world is still trying to catch up. Hopefully an administration change might change this. But I should also mention that as I refer to the government, any of my opinions do not refer to the opinion of the government. I'm speaking as a private citizen. So as far as the nonprofit organization that I founded, what are we doing about it? Well, we engage in energy research and education with scientific integrity. We do sponsor conferences, books, reports, and also the free Future Energy e-news. You can go to our website and sign up for the e-news. It comes out every month. And I really try to reprint the most interesting cutting-edge technologies dealing with energy and propulsion. And we have advocacy for the common good without favoritism. So what you're interested in, though, of course, is UFOs. And so what I want to do is tell you about our 4 major projects and how they're related to UFOs. And to me, this is sort of an autobiographical journey, and I'm happy to share it with you because as I got involved in these projects, I realized each of them have ties to UFOs, and you'll see why. So it's electromagnetic healing devices, permanent magnet motors, zero-point energy, and space propulsion. And we'll do them in that order. How many of you have heard of George Van Tassel? Oh, good. We got a good audience here. Terrific. Well, I'm pleased to say that I used to get his newsletter when I was a kid years ago. And also, I knew people that visited Giant Rock in the 50s when he used to have a space convention in the 60s as well. And of course, that was sort of a magnet for a lot of UFO sightings. And recently, I went to the Integratron as well. Today in Flanders, you can go out there and visit a refurbished Integratron that's owned by a couple sisters that are they're former nurses and very dedicated to preserving it and having seminars there and lectures and so forth. And it's interesting, it's just east of Los Angeles, and it was fun to come up close to the electrostatic absorber, the accumulator that Van Tassel had designed to pull electricity from the air and drive a primary and secondary coil. And here you actually see the primary and secondary coils that should have been finished. It's a strange phenomenon even today to recognize an inverted Tesla coil standing right there. This is the underside of it. And no one's willing to go the next step to actually engage in developing high voltage in this facility. I have to admit, though, since I built Tesla coils, that it's not really a great idea to have high voltage being produced right next to wood. The entire construction of the Integratron is entirely out of wood. There's no nails that were used in the entire construction. So Van Tassel probably didn't have a good conception of what high voltage and combustible materials can do. So perhaps that was one of the intuitive ways that prevented him from finishing it. But the acoustic chamber is amazing. You sit, if you sit right in the center where that cylinder, the pole, the pillar was, it basically rebounds all the sound from your voice back to you. So it feels like it's an unusual feeling to hear no echo at all except for yourself. So it's a fantastic, interesting energy chamber. And from that, I found that reading about Van Tassel caused me to relate to George Lakhovsky's work, Townsend Brown, Nikola Tesla, and of course the ETs who basically were inspiring him along with the Tesla coil concept. And he basically designed it as a rejuvenation chamber. Back years ago when I read this, I didn't think there was anything that could be really understandable from that. But as I got more interested in the 1980s, for example, I developed Gauss meters for measuring power line magnetic fields. I had to be aware of bioelectromagnetics because it became an interesting topic. And also for my business, I started to feel this is a community that needs this type of measuring techniques. For example, anyone watch the UFO Hunters on television? That's a pretty good show. Recently, they were talking about geomagnetic anomalies, and unfortunately, the scientist that's on the show walked around with a handheld Gauss meter. That's totally wrong when you want to measure Earth magnetic fields. The Earth magnetic field in northern hemispheres is almost vertical. So we designed a geomagnetometer that you hold vertically by your hand, and the company is called Integrity Design and Research that bought my business and now still sells these instruments today. The geomagnetometer is great. You can walk back and forth, forming an entire set of data for an entire grid of an area you want to test. And you'll measure within 5 or 10% how the magnetic field of the Earth varies in that area where you think there might be an anomaly. And it was used on the Ghost Hunter program years ago as well. I saw my meter right on television. It was kind of exciting. So I know it is effective in this area of anomalous magnetic field from the Earth. But back to Tesla. Tesla essentially was famous for, in my hometown of Buffalo, New York, developing the first transmission of electricity from Niagara Falls to Buffalo, 25 miles transmission back in 1896. And of course, he also developed in 1898 the application of Tesla coils for electrotherapy. And to me, this is very fascinating, and I ended up investigating this so much so that Tesla had a handle on the application from his own experience. As we see here, there's a quote from Tesla saying that the high voltage electric currents are highly beneficial results in dealing with cancer. Dr. Kolscher was reporting this in 1932. And Tesla also conceived and understood that the body tissues behave like capacitors. Everyone knows what capacitors are. They're parallel plates that store charge. The body's cells actually do that. And in fact, I'm happy to share with you that every cell membrane is like a capacitor. From the research that I've done, found out that every cell actually retains a voltage gradient that's about 100,000 volts per centimeter or 1,000,000 volts per meter. And this gradient is substantial. In other words, 1,000,000 volts across a 3-foot meter or so distance is sufficient to not only break down the air in some cases, depending on the dielectric constant, but in this situation, we find that the body of a person can be subjected to these high voltage pressures, they called them pressures back then, and also be beneficial in charging up the cellular batteries. And that's the exciting part of electrotherapy. And so 100 years later, we're rediscovering what Tesla already knew. In 1908, for example, 100 years ago, they had the Hercules machine, which was a Tesla coil, as you see across the top, and also it was designed as a rotary spark gap with various noble gases that also enhanced the effect. And the noble gas concept was also combined with high voltage therapies. And this particular one with a handle is something that I actually was very fascinated by and decided to build a replica of it. That's also been called the violet ray, by the way. The violet ray is exempt from FDA rules because it's grandfathered. It's that old. And so I developed a Tesla coil in a suitcase, a very compact design, and the premiere, we'll probably have a premiere here tomorrow so you can actually try it. Put high voltage on your body and see how it relaxes pain, gets rid of joint issues. It's amazing the applications that you just discovered by trying it out. And then I worked on an electric chair, but we had to change the name a little bit. I really liked the electric chair concept. I thought it was a great title, but it's already had a derogatory application. But this is fascinating to me too, because Tesla also used the same concept and the same design as he lit a light bulb that you see on the cover of the Tesla, the Master of Lightning. And this is interesting too, because this particular chair has a very high resistance pad that you sit on, and it essentially charges your entire body by contact with the Tesla coil output. And it was debuted at the Whole Person Healing Conference here in Washington, D.C. just a few years ago. And so my book is called Bioelectromagnetic Healing. It summarizes all these things I just talked about, including the information that electrons are antioxidants. This is the discovery I made, and then I found out that there's at least one other scientist that's also published on this topic. And it's fascinating to me to know that as we pop pills in the morning called vitamins, and we take vitamin A and vitamin C, selenium, zinc, things that have antioxidant properties, all that's doing is donating electrons to stop the free radicals. Because the free radicals grab electrons from everything. And so free radicals have been associated with aging. So if you have more powerful antioxidants, that's been shown in television programs and the Science Channel have also demonstrated that we can probably retard aging just by having a high potency, like lipoic acid today is the strongest antioxidant you can buy, CoQ10, for example. But to have an electrical device that would be, say, in your clothes or in an external device you'd use each day, you can pump electrons right into the body directly. And as I'm stating here, electrons are antioxidants. Free radicals steal electrons, creating more free radical damage. And the 10,000 times is actually a quote from the organic textbook that I used in college. And I looked it up, went back to the book, looked up free radicals, and sure enough, as you take a shower in the morning, if you don't have a shower filter with an active charcoal filter, you're bathing yourself in chlorine. And chlorine disassociates at body temperature. And the chlorine atom is a very powerful free radical, and it replicates, causing 10,000 other free radicals in your body. So I encourage everyone to consider having shower filters. And of course, damaged mitochondrial DNA and so forth. So if you want to read more, the book's available. And moving on to the next connection is the permanent magnet motors. You're sort of getting an overview of 4 different presentations combined into one. Isn't this exciting? And we go back to giant rock once again. Now, what happened at giant rock? Well, first of all, I found out about this in 1980 when I read a book called Sunburst: Return of the Ancients by Norman Paulson. And in that book was a picture of a UFO in daylight over giant rock, and then next to it was a policeman that took the picture. And what was interesting to me is that there was a generator associated with it that had something about for self-perpetuating and magnets around the outer edge. By the way, that was a picture of the UFO drawing as well. And you can see that in this left-hand photo that it is kind of oval-shaped across the top, maybe flat-bottomed across the bottom. And then notice the plasma trail below it. And to me, this is very fascinating that the anti-gravity effect is probably associated with the field that is emanating from below the ship. And as I say, the deputy sheriff who took the picture is also here next to it. So this is a very authentic. I was so moved by the book and the story, the land of Mu that was associated with the early origins of the Earth, that I thought, I've got to go out there and visit this and see this generator. So I did. I contacted the organization, stayed there 3 years, and then ended up building a homopolar generator for a master's degree in physics, and convinced my professor to let me do it for a project, master's degree project in physics. So to me, I thought, oh, I've got a free energy generator. And I kept researching it and testing it, thinking that there's great potential here. But the interesting thing is that this is the actual wording from the original book. And then, of course, the later issues, the later editions of the book, he changed the title, he deleted this whole section. If you go on Amazon, for example, you have to get an old copy of the book to be able to read about this part of it. 12 magnets around the outer edge, When I talked to Norman Paulson, he said it was a non-conducting disk. Well, that's not quite a homopolar, but it's sort of interesting that there's 12 magnets around there. And then 2 disks were involved to generate the gravity effect. And so I kept that in mind. I've kept it in mind ever since as far as where can we find this type of arrangement. Well, this one led me into the story of John Searle. In fact, this book is available at our exhibit booth, Anti-Gravity, The Dream Made Reality. We had John Thomas, the author, a couple of years ago, give a double session, an hour-and-a-half presentation on John Searle. And John Searle is a living legend. He has so much detail about how this works. There's like 12 big books he's written. Actually, John Thomas has helped author them, edit them for him. But the bottom line is this particular generator has 12 magnets around the outer edge. And they just happened, you're looking at drawings that were designed by Russians who actually replicated Searle's work around 1990, 10 years after I got involved with the homopolar. And they were German. This was a German presentation that Searle did. And then the Russians found out about it, decided to work on it. And as it turned out, I found out through the Department of Energy, a fellow I know there emailed me, said, hey, these Russians are working on something you might be interested in. Sure enough, I recognized it. This is a Searle device they're making. And they were only doing the outer edge, the outer ring. And here's a kind of a simulation of how this machine's supposed to work. And to the left is John Thomas giving his presentation at our conference on future energy in 2006. We do have the DVDs available. And the fascinating part about the Searle disk, which is the unique type of generator, is that it, at low speeds, produces electricity. At higher speeds, it produces the anti-gravity effect. So all of a sudden, I've got a connection here. The two phenomena, energy and power, we all need them if we're traveling away from the Earth. This is the only device I've found that includes both. And so there's lots of people that have tried and failed in reproducing this. There's lots of extra, as you see, details at the bottom here, connecting it with transistor-type phenomenon. I don't need to get into too much detail, but suffice it to say, the Russians have done a lot of work on it. And so what we did, I found, well, I can give myself a little bit of credit because my institute is dedicated to helping inventors that have such unique inventions and also educating the public about it. So what I did was I found an investor, and the investor was interested enough to pay the Russians to come here to Washington, D.C., spend a week with Russian translators. We went to the Department of Energy as well, spent a day there with due diligence Ph.D. people that grilled them and questioned them. And then a year later, I ended up drafting a patent for them, basically drafting it so that then they could apply for their patent themselves. And as you see, some of the details on the side is that 550 RPM was sort of the critical mode. It wants to accelerate in its RPMs once it gets up to around 600 RPM. And so they had lots of brakes. You can see at the bottom there's various baffling and brakes and various other ways to keep it slowed down so they can just get electricity out of it. And they also had a strange type of phenomenon where the temperature seemed to drop in bands that were concentric around the machine. And the 7 degree C drop, 7 degree, 13 degree F was very substantial, so much so that it explains some of the energy output when you do the math. And here's a picture of us at the Department of Energy. And the two Russians are in the middle, and I'm over there, and basically that's the historic picture of when we first started to do our due diligence on this invention. And since then, there's been a lot of work that's been done. Here's the only photo I'm allowed to show the public of how the progress has been going since then. And 2004 is when this was taken. And the interesting thing is they tried to upgrade the magnets. They decided to get stronger, and they figured, oh, we'll improve it this time when we build it. Well, unfortunately, that wasn't the correct design. So they've had to replace the magnets to go back to the standard type of ferrite magnets that were originally in the original design that worked. And the interesting thing is these are calibrated springs and shock absorbers on the right side, on three sides, that can be used to measure the force if there's any force that's being developed. And since Dr. Ed Mitchell's here today, I thought I'd throw in this slide as well. Here he is with his money in his pocket, looking at a homopolar generator back in 1980. And this was when I actually became involved briefly with Bruce De Palma and his work on the homopolar, because that's how the generator got built at the Sunburst community. It's called the Sunburst machine, and Bruce De Palma built it for them. And notice on this cover of the magazine, we see the Searle disk in the middle and the homopolar to the right. At that time, when this was published, 1994, it wasn't really known that the connection is there between the homopolar and the Searle disk. But nowadays, especially after the patent came out, it's an acceptable, interesting connection. And I think there's a misprint here. Yeah, this should be 1994, not 1998. And so going from magnetism, I do need to share with you the fact that magnetism is a very unusual phenomenon. It's designed and powered by spinning electrons. And the spinning electrons really get their energy from the quantum vacuum. So we really have a source of free energy just sitting there in every magnet, but we're not looking at the magnetic gradient. So I decided to pursue the spiral magnetic motor because here you actually have a gradient, in other words, a changing magnetic field as you go around the cycle. As you can see, the stator is very close at the top, and then it gets wider and wider as you go clockwise around. And this was published in Popular Science in 1979, and this is probably the only machine that works powered by a permanent magnet motor gradient. Now, unfortunately, the Japanese who worked on it, the Kuriteiko company, decided to put an electromagnet up in the left-hand corner there, and this basically destroyed the free energy concept so that it could be self-powered. And instead, we're looking at some other improvements on it that basically are looking very promising these days. But if you wanted to test it for yourself, you can get a copy on, say, Google/patents of this patent from Hartman. It's 4215330. And what's great about this is, and this slide sort of summarizes my arguments about the magnetic gradient, is that you can take and buy very inexpensively a whole bunch of small cylindrical magnets or bar magnets, as you can see in the top view picture, put them together in this arrangement exactly as the patent shows you. Blow up the patent diagram big enough so you can put them right where they belong, and you'll see it propels a ball bearing. Not only propels a ball bearing horizontally, but the ball bearing will climb a 10-degree incline. And of course, the patent even shows you how you connect these in series, and of course, have something, I don't dare say it, perpetual motion? No, I didn't say that. But this is exactly the point, that once you decide these and discover the source of the energy, perpetual motion is explained away. And I found it again and again in physics journals, that they give, what would you say, verbal recognition, and they always put the Latin in there, perpetuum mobile, so it looks a little more scientific, you know. and they'll even put the one sentence that it may look like it, there could possibly be a connection, and then they discount it immediately by the scientific explanation. So it's interesting how the science is advancing, because to me, this is our destiny. We cannot keep burning fuel. We are really at our end of that cycle, and the Humbert's curve proves it. So we have to get into a cleaner fuel source. And all the inventions that we keep coming across prove that this is really our destiny. And here you see some of the ideas. Over in the lower right-hand corner is my particular discovery. I've talked to the author who's published this in IEEE Transactions on Magnets. And this is a fascinating way to produce a pulsed magnetic field without coils. And it's a piezoelectric and giant magnetostrictive device. So I have great hope for that, and we should hopefully be seeing permanent magnet-motored cars. In other words, a magnetic car instead of an electric car. That's my design for the future. In fact, I've even talked to the flywheel people. Bitterly Flywheels, for example, is willing to design the magnets into the flywheel so that we'll have the combination working and the flywheel storing the energy. Now, the third project that I got involved with as well, and I have to give credit to Maury King for pushing me into this area, is the quantum vacuum and zero-point energy. We find lots of connections to various areas in the literature that people love zero-point energy. I mean, you've probably heard, how many people have heard zero-point energy before I've even mentioned it? Great, this is wonderful. You're a good crowd. And then the fact is, you've probably heard lots of exaggerated things about it. However, the scientific stuff is equally as impressive. In fact, the scientific stuff is more impressive, so much so that you tend to disbelieve the actual science. And of course, NASA's done a lot of work on it as well. It's associated with the Casimir effect. Here's a NASA website page that describes 10 to the 24th or 10 to the 58th joules per meter cubed, which is amazing density. It has more energy density in a cubic centimeter of vacuum than there is in nuclear reactors of the same volume. That's the fascinating part about it. And yet no one's figured out how to tap this energy, you know? And that's where I come in. So what I've designed in the book is a lot of different scenarios and discovered inventors already pursuing them. But one of the fascinating areas that I think is the simplest, easiest, and of course solid state is the rectifying of thermal and non-thermal electric noise. Zero-point energy causes noise in circuits. In fact, when you're looking or hearing a hissing sound on your radio or television, you're looking at the quantum vacuum. And you're looking at the background Big Bang noise as well. But the interesting thing is, any noise can be rectified, and that's where diodes come in. And there's lots of diodes I've come across that have zero bias. So, and of course, here's a couple of molecular diodes. It shows how small you can make them. Now, one of our speakers in the 2006 Conference on Future Energy was Dr. Fabrizio Pinno, who used to work for Jet Propulsion Lab. And he spent years there and then decided to form his own company. And it's an interstellar technology company in California. And here's his engine. It uses a Casimir force, but see, when you get down to the quantum vacuum state, you can actually do a lot of tricks. And so in one of my books, I have a whole list of toolkit tricks that a quantum vacuum engineer could actually play with. And one of the tools here he has, where you see RS on, and those of you over there, you see in the middle RS on, those are little micro lasers. When he turns on a micro laser, he totally changes the Casimir force within the cavity. It costs him almost no energy to turn that little laser on, but the Casimir force has a big effect on the whole cavity, pushing electrons. And that's exactly how he's designed it. It's a tiny thing, as you can see, 50 to 100. This is a MEMS device, if you know what MEMS is. And it's working on the micron scale. And of course, you can gang these up so you can get kilowatts and megawatts just by reproducing them. Much like we do right now in flat screen TVs. You've got a whole bunch of diodes in an array, and you're looking at the cumulative effect of all of them. Well, I decided to do this after getting fired from the patent office, I decided to finish my PhD. And interesting enough, and this is a good crowd to tell the story, in 1999, I tried to have my first conference on free energy at the State Department. Do you think I got in trouble for doing that? It worked real good for about a year until the only physicist in the State Department says, oh, we got to have a peer review of your papers. And I had 14 two-day conference, 14 speakers all lined up. And of course, he didn't want to do a peer review. He just wanted to kick me out of the State Department. And the American Physical Society, which I stopped my membership in, decided to attack me in weekly columns. And it's called What's New, Robert Park. And of course, the patent office people read the Robert Park columns and decided, oh, we got to get involved in stopping this. Well, as I inquired on moving out of there to the DOE said, no, we don't want you, you're too controversial now. The place I worked, the Department of Commerce, also became a hotbed of trouble when I even investigated using the auditorium there. So suffice it to say, I turned a bad thing into a good result and did actually investigate zero-point energy for a feasibility study for my PhD. And then I got reinstated 6 years later, which I'm happy to say I actually got some back pay. And recently now, since that was a very technical book, I decided to do a very watered-down layman's book with lots of pictures and also lots of easy explanations and almost no equations at all. And that's Zero-Point Energy, Fuel of the Future, which is available also at the exhibit booth. And so the interesting thing is you see this in the New York Times, you see it in lots of different magazines, and many UFO articles always point to the fact that, yeah, these saucers that fly interstellar must be using zero-point energy for their power source. And this is something that we sort of take for granted, but we don't understand how this could be possible. And so I think there's great hope in the future, and especially now as we get to the last topic, propulsion, I think you'll see that there are a lot of ideas here that are worth pursuing. Now, first of all, when you hear on the Science Channel and other programs about the SETI program and various other scientists that are doing what they call planet hunting, have you ever heard these PhDs say, well, we don't really know where to look, which stars to target to see if there's planets around them? Well, did they ever think of looking at the Betty and Barney Hill story and the star map? Nope, guess not. And interestingly enough, as you look at the Zeta Reticuli incident, we have a few reprints from Astronomy magazine. This star map is the most fascinating star map made, even by astronomers, of our local neighborhood, up to 50 light years from Earth. And 50 light years is not that far. When you consider 100,000 light years is the size of our galaxy, 50 light years is really the range in which we're exposed to. And it took years later for Marjorie Fish to put together a 3D bead and string replication of the star map. And I have to correct that because she did a 50 light year local neighborhood mapping of all the stars and then started to look for the star map to see if there's any correlation. And as it turned out, this star map verified that all the stars in this drawing are solar mass size. The size of our sun, which is very unusual. Our sun is in a minority if you look in the galaxy. They're usually giants, they're usually binaries, there are all kinds of stuff you can learn in astronomy that are really exemptions to finding a place like ours. And so solar mass size is small, compact, and within a short distance, we have this critical zone where the Earth is that supports life. And that's what the astronomers know, but they don't know how to find these stars. Well, all these stars are solar mass size, and they're the only ones in the 50 light year distance. So you got to give Betty Hill a great deal of credit. And of course, she didn't even know that she had recorded this in her mind until she was hypnotized, which adds a lot of authenticity to it as well. So that's the kind of technicalities that I look for. Even Wendell Stevens, for example, you probably know Wendell Stevens and all the books he's written. Well, he's done audio recordings, he's done technical analysis, spectral analysis. That's how you finally get down to how the machines are working on the ships. And many of them, of course, since they're rotary, probably are rotary turning and spinning engines. But to me, this is a very valuable piece of evidence. And I look forward to actually sending this, and I have sent this to astronomers to at least invite them to kind of get interdisciplinary. There's no reason they have to stay in their telescope thinking that they have to guess at where to point it. They can actually take some suggestions from the other side, so to speak. And of course, when we talk about propulsion, there's lots of historical anti-gravity research. And this is the interesting thing as well, that in the physics journals, such as 1962, we see specific ways to create an anti or opposing upward gravitational field. And to me, this is very interesting. Many of them, of course, require a lot of energy, and that can also be a little bit prohibitive. But I luckily was involved in helping Nick Cook when he wrote The Hunt for Zero Point and the attempt to identify and describe the classified world of anti-gravity technology. And he visited lots of places and people, and for example, the president of Lockheed, and he did a videotape as well about this afterwards. I don't know if you saw The $1 Billion Secret. It was a 2-hour special. It was on the Discovery Channel. And of course, he's sitting in front of the president of Lockheed, and he's asking him, well, what are white projects? Oh, white projects are things that we can work on, and we can talk about, and we can describe to him. And then there were some other projects as well. And he says, what are black projects? And he says, well, black projects are the kind that we cannot talk about. And then he shut up. Nick Cook asked another question about black projects, and there was no answer. So that's about as far as you get with the direct route. But the indirect route is a good way to do it as well, and that is accumulate the evidence, spend years recording anecdotes, like Paul Hill did, and then get somebody like Robert Wood to put together the book and get it published years later after you pass away, and then we have an historic record of the behavior of UFOs and the fact that they obey physics laws. The inertia, for example, the right-hand turns. I'm fascinated by the fact that UFOs do right-hand turns. And even some classified projects apparently do it as well. Craft do it. And what I call them are inertia-free turns, and you'll see why in a second. But the interesting thing is, Paul Hill does a great analysis. If you have the ability to create the force, like a 10G reversal, you basically can see it happening in less than a second. So a person sitting on Earth looking at this UFO make a very quick turn, he might think that it's violating the laws of physics. But Paul Hill proves in this book, and I highly recommend it for people investigating any science behind UFOs, to find that you can actually explain, as he does, comparing airplane acceleration and saucer acceleration, the same principles apply. And the banking effect on this diagram here is true. Saucers will bank when they turn, just like airplanes do, because the force is being projected out of the bottom. So this is the future. For example, here's a good video to show you what I'm talking about. Now watch this saucer very closely as we pan out. Get ready. Everybody see that? I love it. And see, that type of acceleration is really something that I think is our future too, because the field propulsion also involves the separation of what's causing the inertia, and I'll explain that in a second. So here's some examples of UFOs that have at least had some scientific explanations behind them that a physicist could actually look at and then try to make some sense out of it. The electrokinetics of Townsend Brown, John Searle's electrogravitics, and of course the secondary gravitational effects like the Lazar saucer. He's given a couple of lectures that are on videotape explaining how the nuclear strong force can actually be connected to gravity. And it does make sense. There is some physics there that's worth pursuing. The Adamski UFO, the Andreasen UFO. And so the interesting thing is we've oftentimes in audiences, especially, for example, at National Space Society, when I give a similar lecture, I tone it down as far as the mention of UFOs, of course, but I at least include this slide and some of the others, because here's research that is now, to me, very scientifically valid in associating subsonic flight and superluminal flight. And we find the form of the equations are identical, and also the behavior of the curves are exponential as you approach the barrier, the velocity barrier. And of course, the bottom graphs show the same thing, that as we look at the speed of sound and the speed of light, you tend to get a compression effect in the medium. And of course, in air, you're getting a compression of air, but what kind of medium is being compressed as you're flying through space? Well, it's the quantum vacuum. Quantum vacuum literally exhibits a compression as well, and it's called Einstein-Hopf drag. So there's interesting viscous drag being compared to the Lorentz force that's exerted by the zero-point field. And this is a close-up of the two graphs showing the flight resistance increase with speed. And so David Froning, who shared these graphs with me, and I saw him in Utah at a local chapter meeting of the National Space Society, is pursuing this very seriously in terms of the simulations, the mathematical analysis, and he hopes to actually see a working model of this soon. And so the interesting thing is that the superluminal saucer, as we call it, is being evolved in design as a saucer design. He's forced to conclude, and this I find very exciting, from basic principles, he comes up with a saucer design because he wants to include a toroid. And a toroid is circular. So all of a sudden we have a discovery that saucers now have scientific reasoning. In other words, there's something inside them that obeys our physics laws, and it's understandable. And the toroid is exactly how he's perturbing the quantum vacuum electromagnetic field. The two are connected. And you can see the field lines that he's creating with the toroid at the bottom here. You can visit quantumfields.com if you want to learn more about his work. I find it very promising and very encouraging. And what I should include also, and it's here in the center, is that the zero-point field, the quantum vacuum field, loses its drag when the temperature approaches 0 degrees absolute. Anybody know the temperature of outer space? It's about 3 degrees absolute. It's like the closest you can get to 0 and the closest you can get to losing drag. This is an optimal place to travel if you know what fuel to use. And now here's a simulation, just a couple of slides to show you the comparison of space-time warping and vacuum polarization. And we're moving to your left. This is at 0.99, the speed of light. And this is comparing the thermal radiation pressures of air on the left and the vacuum pressures of the zero-point radiation on the right. And we're still at 0.99 of that barrier speed, which of course is different in air versus light. And the interesting thing is that with air pressures, there's a positive thermal radiation pressure that tends to resist. In other words, at the bottom you see retardation moving to the right, motion is to the left. Now, this tends to be an accepted and taken for granted phenomenon. Of course, Chuck Yeager was pretty afraid when he broke the sound barrier. He didn't know if the pressures would get too great, of course, you know. But now what's interesting is the negative zero-point vacuum radiation, and these are slides still from David Fronig, exert on a high-speed vehicle, guess what? It's in the same direction of motion. So you've got an impulsion effect that actually aids in the movement of the saucer if it's designed properly to interact with the quantum vacuum. And this is just a couple of about a 20-slide chain of simulations that go to several times the speed of light. At the speed of light, we still have a very high pressure at the very point of that saucer. And then at 2 times the speed of light, we see a trail, much like you do with a sonic boom trail behind the airplane that's breaking the sound barrier. Shock wave, in other words. 3 times, it's becoming more compressed. And there's several more that accompany that as well. So as we move on to various other types of anecdotal reports, I do have to give credit to Stephen Greer and the Disclosure Project for including in his book this particular diagram of a cross-section of a small saucer that was around the 1952 sighting in the Belgian Congo. And what's interesting is it seems to be a domestically created one because it had radar included and various other things that involve some circular motion as well, rotating rim, in other words. And if anyone of you know about the Andreasen affair, the first book is actually a better one for these diagrams I'm about to show you. The second book gets more into the continuing saga. But a friend of mine, Paul Potter, was kind enough to share these slides of his, I would say, artistic rendition of the Andreasen ship as reported in this book. First of all, he describes the crystal spheres at the bottom as being charged up. And without going into a lot of the detail, although you should be at least impressed with the scientific detail that he's referencing in explaining how the ship is being powered. Notice in the upper right-hand corner, the Journal of Applied Physics is cited to give reference to dielectrophoresis and how the high-intensity field can actually cause the suspense, he calls them suspensoids, but it's a liquid medium that's surrounding these spheres to be able to build up charge. And here's an overview of how these 4 spheres interact with the toroidal arrangement of the polarized charges in what he calls an electrofluid. And of course, this is advanced physics. Nobody knows about this stuff on Earth, but you got to give somebody like Paul Potter a lot of credit because he's approaching the unusual with an open mind, applying all the laws of physics that we know today. And it makes sense. That's the interesting thing is the ship design has some rationale to it that can be scientifically explained. And of course, he has a whole bunch of slides like this, showing the flow of charge, the increase in forces that are involved, and of course, even the ionizing flow of air is contributing to the power that he's able to describe the ship being developed. And this is one of the last slides that he describes the electron flow, the fluid flow, and the toroidal magnetic flux that's involved at the atomic level for creating interatomic repulsive forces. And so at least he's made an attempt that I believe is scientifically valid to help explain this, along with, of course, the circuit diagram. And for electroengineers, what more could you ask for? It gives you the temptation to go home and build it, or go into your lab and build it. And of course, this is the type of work we need to do here on Earth to be able to be free enough to go to Mars, to be able to be free enough to even get out of our solar system. And so some of these other types of ships actually exhibit what we call electrogravitics or electrokinetics. What I found after editing 2 books on electrogravitics, I found that it's still a mysterious concept. It's a concept where gravity can be affected by high voltage electricity, and we see this on the B-2 bomber, for example. Night sightings actually show the purple glow around the wings, but the effect of affecting gravity with it is still a mystery. Now, what you see here with the Grangemouth UFO is that some of the what would you call pods, there's 3 pods underneath them, like the Adamski craft, and only 2 of them are active at any particular time. Now, for a propulsion engineer, that immediately gives you the indication this is involved directly with the propulsive force. And why are they being activated? To provide force in one direction, of course. And then the next thing is analyzing the UFO energies and finding out, of course, some reasonable explanation. There's a little bit more footage just to give you. It's hard to say what all of that is, but it's certainly entertaining. Now, Bob Lazar, who I've actually met in Las Vegas and has gone through lots of, if you ever heard his story, lots of harassment, very similar to Jonathan Reed. You know, his scholastic accreditation, his employment accreditation, all of those seem to be erased after he was involved in the difficulties that he faced with confronting the government. But Lazar's story is that he worked at Area 51 for a while, and Ed Teller actually hooked him up there. And Ed Teller's been on film acknowledging that he recommended Bob Lazar for the job. But Bob didn't last too long because he was an upstart, and he decided to bring his friends up to seeing Area 51 from a distance. And of course, the security guards caught him, and then he got in trouble and so forth. But the interesting thing is Bob is a physicist, and he approached the information that he learned with a very inquiring mind and a very scientific mind, so that he attempted, and I have to give him credit for at least attempting, to come up with an explanation for the very heavy material he saw, which he guessed could be element 115, and to describe how the radioactive decay of that element could actually be contributing to what he calls the gravity emitters. And these are as you see in an antimatter reactor that's in his drawing here, that is focusable or directionable. And so there's various devices that have been, for example, the sports model has been developed by Testar. You can actually buy, I believe you can still buy a plastic model as a toy if you want your own sport model at home to look at. And it's good that it's being integrated into society as well, so that kids start thinking about something else than just airplanes with wings, and of course, plastic devices like that. But the interesting explanation is that there's a connection between the nuclear strong force and the gravitational force that's being activated by these gravity emitters. and the element 115 is providing the energy source of it. Whether or not element 115 is actually stable, it's been synthesized since then, and that's sort of a debatable topic as well. But the fascinating thing is that when we get up to uranium and plutonium, the size of our Earth is basically connected to the heaviest elements we find here. So his argument was that this craft came from a slightly heavier planet, therefore you can get up into the hundreds where these elements are still stable and found on that planet. Now one of the last topics I wanted to share with you is the field propulsion concept that helps at least explain the right angle turns. Recently I saw this particular graph, this photo, this slide, on UFO hunters, and Bruce Cornett was actually in possession of it, which I'm happy he finally got a copy. And as you know, or as you may know, Pine Bush near Stewart Air Force Base has been a hotbed for a lot of sightings, and a lot of photos have been taken there. Well, I happen to know I did know the photographer of this particular slide, and the way he described it was this was a delta-shaped craft that was flying low overhead with a very low noise hum to it. It had an inverse Doppler effect. In other words, as it got further away from him, the sound went up instead of down. Because as you know, Doppler effect, normally you get a lower tone as it goes down, that farther away. And it had these two plasma lights that were very close together, but they were very bright. And it had blinking red and green tail lights that made it look like it was a normal normal aircraft, in other words, blinking on and off. And what's interesting is he took this photo with an open shutter on a tripod, 35mm camera, as he's looking overhead. And as this light trail starts, it starts from the top, and then all of a sudden, the craft made a right angle turn. And then continued overhead as the picture, or the line goes downward. And so he analyzed the right angle turn. And this is such an abrupt right angle turn that, that we agreed that this would be highly unusual and virtually impossible for any aircraft to achieve on Earth, and with domestic planes that we know about. So we have to conclude that there's some unusual shielding effect that allows the craft to move in such rapid directions and not have the usual curving because of the internal forces. You know, the G-forces would be severely destructive to anyone inside the craft, normally. But the fascinating thing is, when you get into zero-point energy, is that there have been articles published, and I know Hal Puthoff, as a personal friend, it was published an article as in the Physical Review in 1994, explaining and theoretically proving that inertia is a zero-point Lorentz force. And see, Lorentz force is usually associated with electromagnetic behavior. You know, you push a magnet into a coil, you get a backward force. But he's explaining the fact this is an electromagnetic medium. Quantum vacuum is full of polarized virtual particles. And the fact is, as he explains here as well, is that the Davies-Unruh effect, the resistance to acceleration, is coming as, for example, you go around a curve. When you're driving, you're going around a curve quickly, your body tends to resist. As Newton's second law, you tend to go in the same direction as you were initially going. But the fact is, why do you do that? Why is inertia even effective? Well, you know, the physicist, in graduate school, is so fascinating to see really good, rigorous explanations for everything. But when it came to inertia, they have no explanation at all. Even Einstein couldn't explain it. And it's called the equivalence principle. And they keep testing this to see if they're right. Is the inertial mass the same as gravitational mass? Well, we test it, see what happens. Yeah, it seems to be pretty close. So they have no idea. And in fact, the best explanation that physicists of the highest level and using the standard model have for inertia is that it's an interaction with distant stars. Yeah, right. But that's sort of like an esoteric connectiveness. Maybe there's a quantum entanglement effect here or something. No, it's an electromagnetic effect. And that's exactly what Hal Puthoff, Reda, and Hayes has proposed. And what's great about it, before he passed away, Arthur C. Clarke acknowledged this particular article and the next one they published around the same time about gravity being a zero-point Lorentz force. And I'm working on magnetism being 0. Of course, anyways, these particular authors were commemorated in the Arthur C. Clarke book on 3001. So he calls this the new space drive that's developed a thousand years later, and probably a lot sooner because we recognize this potential. Now, and you can see at the bottom here, this equation is just V cross B. It's just velocity cross the magnetic field creates a force. So suffice it to say, long story short, I had an argument with the deputy director of the NRO about this exact problem. And I handed them this slide, the benefits of inertial shielding. And I handed them the other slide that Bruce Cornett took. And I said, here, it seems that classified vehicles already are doing right-angle turns. The only way they can do it is by inertial shielding, because we know that inertia is caused by interaction. If you shield it properly with either high voltage field or high magnetic field, there probably won't be an interaction anymore. And what's better to do that in a circular craft? You know, we keep coming back to that wonderful design. Why are these crafts circular? Well, there's lots of great benefits. And as we analyze them, we find even more. Well, this is Newton's second law, F equals ma. All of you know that probably from high school physics. But what if this inertial mass, which is what m really is, could be reduced? And that's exactly what I'm describing here. Your inertial mass goes to 0. Well, what happens with the force and the acceleration? You could apply a very small amount of force, and you get a lot of acceleration. And that's what we saw in the video. This craft takes off super fast. and we can't understand how could it accelerate so quickly, or how could another craft do a right-angle turn? They're both caused by reducing the inertial mass. And this, to me, is a primary area of graduate study investigation that could easily be simulated in the lab. And I'm hoping to actually, and I interact with grad students all the time. They write to me, they email me, they ask me for suggestions. So I'm happy to say that I keep dropping little seeds in the heads of grad students who are really open-minded. They're saying, what can I work on that'll really help society? Well, this is exactly where you want to work. Because NRO doesn't want to declassify this. We have to reinvent it so it'll come out at a lower classification level. And of course, NASA's sort of doing something similar. NASA's proposed a force field of megavolts to protect them from charged space radiation. But look at the silly design they've got. A bunch of big balloons around the moon settlement. So it's interesting, though, that they're aiming in the same direction. That they not only recognize that high voltage could be helpful, because I don't know if you saw the Trip to Mars movie, but there's several documentaries as well that says if we go to Mars, every single cell in the astronaut's body will be penetrated at least once by cosmic rays. And even the astronauts described on the Apollo missions that when they closed their eyes, they would see blinking lights. And these are cosmic rays going right through their retina. So you spend a lot of time in space, your cells are going to be destructively hit with a lot of tiny particles of various sizes. Now, think of the scenario that, of course, there must be true for people who, I would say people, but ETs who spend a lot of time in space. If you can shield your craft so that anything coming into it with high velocity and high inertial mass all of a sudden loses its inertial mass, the acceleration is going to go to 0. I mean, the velocity will tend to go to 0. And as soon as it hits something, it'll have no impact or penetrating ability. And that's the beauty of this type of inertial field rather than just an electrostatic force field. So the propulsion theories I've published in like Atlantis Rising, for example. We've seen some in UFO magazine on the UFO propulsion topics. I got involved in publishing in UFO Sightings magazine on electrogravitics. And there was a bunch of different research that I investigated in the Townsend Brown work. Brown and Bonson Lab, for example, they patented a bunch of high voltage devices that had propulsion effects. And here you see a little lifter video showing how they work. has a very fine wire that's attached to this, providing the high voltage to the little holes that you see on the top. And it's a non-symmetric capacitor that he's created. But I have a disclaimer at the bottom, and the disclaimer basically identifies this as simply ion wind. This is really an ion wind demonstration, and yet it's often described as electrogravitics. So I know Tim Ventura, and of course he's a great guy in building stuff and also interviewing people. His website is worth visiting, AmericanAntigravity.com. But as we get into the real electrogravitics, as I pointed out before, the B-2 bomber actually shows this kind of phenomenon. And I have to share with you that we're down to the last 200 copies of our, actually down to the last 87 copies of this particular book, because Paul LaViolette, who was very generous in donating his paper on the B-2, has now withdrawn the rights to that paper. So electrogravitic systems will still be in print, but it will no longer contain that particular paper. So if you would like a historic collector's item, we still do have a few copies left. And what I've done in this book, when this was published 10 years ago, is to, and literally we published it right around the time the B-2 was available, within a year or so when it came out, because Paul had analyzed all of the high voltage phenomena associated with it, including the depleted uranium that was used to be visible on the leading edge of the B-2, and the flame jet generator that was used to create the high voltage separation, and the fact that Townsend Brown had designed all this and described it in his papers. Well, the Army Research Lab and the Office of Naval Research both have done work in this area. And this graph, particularly on the left, shows the connection between the DC kilovolts and the disk speed. What Townsend Brown did, and you got to give him a lot of credit and courage, he demonstrated in front of the Navy, Office of Naval Research, a merry-go-round that was powered by only high voltage. And you see this in the Free Energy Race to Zero Point movie, the video that's on DVD now. It's been out for about 10 years as well. And what was fascinating is that there was a report afterwards by one of the colonels, lieutenant colonels, and he's reporting to the general, and he says, I saw this demonstration, but it's in the hands of civilians. And he's writing here that, how much fear he has about this, because it's advanced propulsion. But the fact is, it produces a pound of force for a kilowatt of input. So, but it was related mostly to ionic mobility because it was static high voltage. Now, what I found is, and that's where the second book comes in, Electrovitics 2, is then I got into the more intriguing high voltage pulsed phenomena that haven't been explained. And when you look at the, and right here you see a diagram that Townsend Brown published in 1929. He says, how I control gravitation. And he describes an experiment here that involves 44-pound weights on a glass rod that are being powered by 100,000 volts. And his words in the article are describing the fact that they start to turn. He actually gets a force. In fact, in this case, the direction of movement is only in one way to the right. But he has another one where it's actually a torsion pendulum design. In either case, the key is that he describes the fact he turns on the electricity, and guess what happens? It starts to move, but then it goes back to the starting point. He says, but the electricity is still on. I don't understand. Why doesn't it keep moving? Because all my other craft used to do it, keep moving. But this is no longer an ionic wind phenomenon. It's something else. It's pulsed electrokinetics. And what I found very synchronistic, and of course NASA's published on it too, got patents on it as well, is that the electrokinetic equation that Oleg Jeffimenko, who's a professor from West Virginia University, developed, and he didn't even know Townsend Brown's work. I wrote to him and asked him, did you know Townsend Brown was using the same phrase, electrokinetics, when you designed your equation? He said no. But this was developed in parallel, and his equation explains how pulsed electricity can actually cause forces. Rudolf Zinser. This is my book on Rudolf Zinser. It's an edited book. I've had German translated. He's been a mystery since 1980 when I saw him in Germany, and then 1981 when I saw him in Toronto. Same phenomenon type. Pulsing a dielectric parallel plate capacitor. It causes a force. which in this case is sustained and a long-lasting force. And the interesting thing is that this was a hot topic back in the 50s. Gravity was on the cover of many of the newspapers and the cover pages, and all of this is reprinted in the second book as well. Now, what I'd like to finish up with, and some of you may have already heard Mark McCandlish give this talk, and this is his drawing, and you got to give him credit to Mark McCandlish, he has a copyright on this drawing, for explaining the fact that these are pulse capacitors on this flat bottom craft with 1950s rivets that was demonstrated in 1988 as something that a congressman saw and several other people saw, and Mark was also invited to go see in a hangar at an Air Force base, and which was also 3 of them hovering over the ground. And what I found interesting, this can also be explained by electrokinetic equation. The pulsing causes the pulse through it. Now, I thought I'd share this with you also. When I mentioned that Hal Puthoff had done due diligence on this, because I heard about it, Hal Puthoff wrote back an email. He says, I can't be accused of endorsing this. This is exactly what I did. All I did was determine my due diligence was independently interview the source of the story, verify he didn't tell it, independently interview another individual who had the same story and compared the two, and they were the same. But I can't say that it's true. It just remains in my gray basket as possibly true. That's a physicist for you, defining truth in little gray areas. So in the future, if you want to visit CyrilEffect.com, you can see this drawing by John Thomas's son, where saucers will have equal share. I see the vision of the future. I see when saucers will be free to share airport space with conventional jet airplanes. And we might even have identified transportation as well. But who knows if it will happen down here on Earth. Let's hope for the best. So as zero-point energy becomes more acceptable and understandable and implemented in propulsion and energy designs, Aviation Week and Space Technology predicts that it may emerge from the realm of science fiction and may be the key to deep space travel. Thank you very much. Do we have time for questions? 5 minutes for questions? I don't see a mic in the audience, so I'll probably have to repeat your question, but if anyone does have any, I'll take a few of them. Well, he's asking how close we are for transportation of cars, and it's fascinating you mention that because I have another whole talk on future energy. I go into a lot of these new energy developments for domestic use and applications. And one thing I didn't mention today is the PAP engine. PAP was an inventor who demonstrated for Richard Feynman, who's a famous Nobel Prize-winning physicist. And if you go to Infinite Energy, infinite-energy.com, you can order a DVD of the PAP engine being demonstrated. Well, I personally happen to know an investor in that company called Infinite Horizons, and they're in California. Millions have been put into reproducing that invention. What is the PAP engine? All it does is it uses noble gases in the piston in the chamber of a standard internal combustion engine and sparks it. But there's no exhaust. You keep using the same gas and you keep pulsing it and pressuring it and cause an explosion. You keep pressuring again and causing an explosion. And what they've demonstrated in the lab now is every time they pulse it, it explodes, and they predict it can last for 3,000 hours of continuous use. And then you change the noble gas mixture. So to me, there's lots of hope. Oh, by the way, if you go to my website, integrity-research.org, you'll see the Future Energy e-news that was just sent out, and lithium batteries now are becoming 10 times better. So the Tesla Roadster, for example, is a good example of a totally emission-free electric vehicle that's now bigger and better and more storage and more power, and batteries continually get better. So I'm seeing electric cars as being really the wave of the future, and especially as we get ways to charge them with that little black box that basically doesn't need any extra input.
Dr. Valone, over here, Dr. Valone.
Okay. Oh,
we have formulas that manipulate energy, show us conversion factors and stuff like that. But what is the energy? What's its essence? What is the essence of energy? What is it? You know?
What is the essence of energy?
Yeah.
Oh, well, that's in my book, Zero Point Energy, Fuel of the Future.
Can you say briefly what it is?
Well, and to tell you the truth, 0 point energy is the source of energy in our bodies, in atoms. Helputhoff's published on this. For example, every nucleus that has an electron at a certain level around the nucleus, you know, we all know the Bohr modeled the atom. Well, guess what? They're electrically opposite. They should be attracting and collapsing. And you should be compiled into a little tiny amount of mass. But instead, the electrons stay outward because of quantum fluctuations. And the quantum fluctuations are powering all the atoms and literally providing us with a lot of energy. So energy is the ability to do work, is the physics definition, and the body finds lots of ways to do work, and physical systems find a lot of ways to convert energy. But everyone has an intuitive idea of it, so I would refer you to some of the books on that topic, and specifically my book on 0 point. You can now tie more and more phenomena directly to 0 point energy. Next question.
Dr. Valone, a question. Previous speaker, Richard Dolan, talked about the possibility of there being parallel tracks of technical development, not in government. Stephen Greer was here last fall and spoke exactly about that. You know Stephen well, and he's published his concerns and assertions about that. Mm-hmm. Historically, Alan Hynek and others talked about pre-World War II development along some of these tracks you were discussing in Germany, Serbia, and other places. Soviet Union was doing things we're not still real sure what they were doing at different times, but you touched on those. Have you seen in your research any evidence or anything you can talk about regarding parallel development of these things that could be somewhat of an explanation for what Lazar saw? Because if there was a clandestine project capitalizing or exploiting Nazi technology, if you will, that may have come with some of our Project Paperclip scientists we brought over, not the Rocket Boys, but the other guys, it would have been politically very difficult to talk about that in the 40s and 50s and 60s. It also could have sparked a parallel arms race. And that was the question that seems to be underpinning so much of the technical UFO flying saucer thing. If it was German, it would be indeed alien. But have you seen anything about that in your research, and what's your comment about it?
Well, if you're referring to German Nazi type of research only, since you covered many different areas there, I would refer you to Nick Cook's book, Hunt for 0 Point, because that book in particular really focuses on the German research pretty exclusively. He does a lot of detailed investigation. Since he's a science journalist, he really knows how to dig into it. But as far as explaining Bob Lazar's work, I still respect the attempt he's made and still try to give some credence to the other work that has related the nuclear strong force to gravitation. And I believe sooner or later we'll see that that perhaps is a way that physics can resolve that issue, that gravity doesn't have to be so mysterious.
Okay, so we have the dogma that you can't get more out than what goes in unless it's nuclear. So do you subscribe to that? Because John Kansas has blown that out of the water. If anyone's seen 60 Minutes, they did the thing about the cancer research that he came up with, but they never touched on the part where he's able to break water and the hydrogen and oxygen apart in water with the same radio frequencies. And he's getting more out than what's going in. Dr. Bruce De Palma in his N machine also put out more energy than what's going in. And I had an idea for a motionless induction generator, and 6 guys working together seemed to beat me to the punch. And they've got a 500% efficient device. So what's your take on that dogma?
Well, that's a good question, and certainly I can give another whole lecture just on that topic. Free energy used to be and it still is, my key phrase that I promote. And I was a consultant for that video, Free Energy Race to 0 Point. So I really sympathize with the attempt to look at over-unity engines, including Bruce De Palma's and others that you're referring to. However, I caution you also that as you analyze efficiency output over input, or however you refer to it. Even the heat pump, for example, is a good example. The heat pump is over unity, standard heat pump. But what's interesting about it is that you end up analyzing it and seeing that, yes, you're converting environmental energy to be able to achieve the over unity aspect. So whether or not the ones that you cited are really, truly sources of free energy, you can only tell if they sit alone and they don't have any connections and they continually put out energy without needing recharging. I feel eventually we will, and we are, discovering new sources, but we won't have to call them free energy anymore because we'll identify the source of the energy, as I've done in the 0 Point book, and then deal with it. And so then we've got a little more acceptable and much more acceptable source that can then be commercialized. So, thank you very much.